Ah, yes. I'm finally dedicating a video to the Sega Saturn, the console which helped give me my namesake. During its incredibly short lifespan, the Saturn had quite a few games planned for it that never released, and so today, I wanted to talk about a few of those, though this won't be a comprehensive list. I'm just covering stuff I personally find interesting. But you can discuss any cancelled Saturn games I didn't cover in the comments. But before we begin, I want to thank you for watching. First, let's talk about Fighting Circus Elendall. This game's production began a while after the release of Sonic CD, when Sonic creator and director Naoto Oshima seemingly wanted to make a 3D fighting game about a bunch of circus performers for Sega's upcoming 1994 console. If you didn't know, traditional forms of amusement like circuses, carnivals, and Christmas are interests of his that obviously show in a lot of his work, particularly in the designs of Dr. Eggman and Knights. But speaking of Knights, it's seemingly the reason this game was cancelled. In late 1994, Sonic Team was officially reformed and Oshima switched focus to a new project, which became Knights. However, while Oshima abandoned Fighting Circus, the project as a whole seemingly wasn't abandoned by Sega and was left in the hands of Yosuke Okunari, but it was quickly cancelled a short while after. It was known for a while that between Sonic CD and Nights into Dreams, Oshima was working on a fighting game project, but the game's name wasn't revealed until 2023. When, upon being questioned about it, he posted on Twitter some information about the game and this concept art, stating, "All these characters are temporary." That's all we know about this project for now, and if any prototypes ever existed, none have surfaced. Now let's jump into one of the more interesting stories for an unreleased game on the system, Cybersled. Cybersled was an arcade arena shooter made by Namco and part of their UGSF series of games. It was set to be ported to the Sega Saturn and be developed by Namco's US home division, Namco Home Tech. However, after the success of Ridge Racer on the PlayStation, Namco decided to dedicate all of their home console efforts to the PlayStation. And Namco never released any games on the Saturn or even the Nintendo 64, though late in its life they would release Namco Museum 64, which only came out in North America in 1999. And they licensed out the Ridge Racer name for Nintendo to release Ridge Racer 64 in 2000, once again exclusively in Western territories. Namco would continue to release a few games for Nintendo's Super Famicom after finding success with the PlayStation, but most of their home console efforts in the mid to late 90s were dedicated to the PlayStation. However, despite Namco silently pulling away from the Sega Saturn, according to internal documents, Cybersled was still set to release for the system even as late as June of 1996. A PlayStation port of Cybersled was released in early 1995 before the Saturn had even released in North America, and it seems because of this, more pressure was put on Namco Home Tech to make the Saturn version compete with it seemingly being retooled and renamed to Cybersled Remix. It's speculated that Namco's waning relationship with system manufacturers that weren't Sony and struggles with the Sega Saturn's 3D hardware could be the reasons this port was cancelled. Also, according to a rumor from Game Players magazine's February 1996 issue, the lead programmer was poached by Shiny Entertainment, likely causing more issues with development. While no prototype of this version has ever been made available, Rick Lucy, who worked at Namco Home Tech, has shared some concept art on his blog. Grand Theft Auto was planned to be released for the Saturn with a release date for December of 1996, but it never came, supposedly because of the console's lack of popularity in Western markets, or the team not having the budget for it, and the game itself wouldn't see release until 11 months later due to a troubled production. Similarly, An enhanced version of the game was planned for the Nintendo 64 after the PlayStation version's success, but it was cancelled as well for unknown reasons. The Saturn version was showcased in a few UK gaming magazines throughout 1996, but it could be likely that these are actually screenshots of the PC version using an alternate graphics set that can be found in the game, as has been rumored judging from the screenshots. But if a Saturn version ever made it particularly far into development, no build has ever surfaced. However, this wouldn't be the franchise's last run-in with Sega consoles. While the hilariously obscure Grand Theft Auto 2 saw release on the Dreamcast, it wasn't the only GTA game planned for it, as Grand Theft Auto 3 was originally planned for the Dreamcast and a tech demo was created. However, because of the Dreamcast sales failure, the project was moved to the PlayStation 2 and the rest is history. But GTA wasn't the only series stuck on the number 5 to have its first installment be snubbed of a Sega Saturn release. The Elder Scrolls Arena was also set to be released for the Sega Saturn. It was being developed by Japanese studio Something Good and was set to be published by SoftBank in Japan, simply called Arena, though a US release was supposedly planned as well. They were also working on a PlayStation version of the game at the same time. Both were teased in Japanese gaming magazines with screenshots throughout fall of 1995, including a peek at this awesome box art for the game. But it was seemingly cancelled sometime afterwards for no apparent reason. No prototypes of either the Saturn or PlayStation versions have ever surfaced. Guilty Gear has shockingly grown into one of the biggest fighting game franchises in recent years, but it originally had its humble beginnings on the original PlayStation in 1998. But even before that, the game was going to see release on the Sega Saturn as well. It was listed in a software release schedule in Sega Saturn magazine's January 17, 1997 issue with a price of 5,800 yen. And a release date set for July of 1997, 10 months before the game would actually release on the PlayStation. It was later listed in the same magazine's September 30th issue in the same year with the same price, but now with a vague fall release date. The same information was also included in the Sega Saturn Perfect Catalog booklet. However, no information about the port is known outside of these sources, and it seems the game's developers have never commented on it. No prototype of this version has ever been released, and it's unknown if this version even made it into the prototype phase. Resident Evil 2's strange development cycle has been really well documented over the years, but one thing that isn't brought up as often is that just like its predecessor, it was planned to also see release on the Sega Saturn. It was seemingly scrapped due to difficulties that face most 3D games released on both the PlayStation and Saturn, and likely the fact that by the time the PlayStation version was released, the Saturn was barely seeing support in the international market. The developers working on the port, Nextech, were instead moved to help work on an original Resident Evil title for Sega's next system that would later become Resident Evil Code Veronica, which was actually planned to be a launch title for the Dreamcast in Japan. The Saturn port of Resident Evil 2 was mentioned in several gaming magazines across the world, but nothing more than that is known, so it's unknown how far it made it into development. Luckily, Sega fans would get to experience the game on the Dreamcast nearly 2 years after the PlayStation version's release. Virtua Fighter 3 was originally going to be released for the Saturn. However, due to the complexity of the Model 3 hardware the arcade game ran on, difficulties arose, and the game was eventually moved to the Dreamcast as a launch title, and given multiple improvements to make up for the long wait for a console port. The Saturn conversion was originally announced at E3 1996. Later that year, a promotional trailer featuring nothing but pre-rendered cinematics, something rarely done by Sega AM2, was released in Japan. Later, Sega's European marketing director, Andy Mee, announced in the February 1997 issue of UK Sega magazine Mean Machines that because of the difficulties AM2 was facing trying to replicate the arcade experience on the Saturn, the Saturn version of Virtua Fighter 3 would come bundled with an expansion device that could also be bundled with potential future ports of Model 3 arcade games to the Saturn. The last time it was mentioned was in the previously mentioned Sega Saturn Perfect catalog with a vague 1998 release date set for it. It's unknown how far the expansion that allowed this port to be played made it into development, if it was real at all, and if any prototypes were ever made of the game. And no prototypes have surfaced. Virtua Fighter 3 wasn't the only AM2 game originally meant for the Saturn that was moved to the Dreamcast, however. There was also another game they had in development for the Sega Saturn that was extremely ambitious. This later morphed into the contentious Shenmue. Regardless of what you think of the game, you can't deny that it was very ambitious, so it makes sense why it was moved to the Dreamcast. It initially started out life as The Old Man and the Peach Tree, a game set in the city of Luoyang in 1950s China, starring a character named Taro trying to find a kung fu master and was to play more like a traditional JRPG. A prototype was made, but nothing is known about this version of the game other than its concept. However, the ambition started kicking in, and the game was changed to be a Virtua Fighter spin-off RPG starring Akira from that series, being a prequel to the events of the first game. After this stage of development, however, it was decided to make the game an original IP. The only footage of this prototype can be found after beating the Xbox version of Shenmue 2, which contains 5 minutes of silent footage of a tech demo, showing off many events that would transpire in the Shenmue games, only starring Akira as the protagonist rather than Ryo from the final games. It's very impressive for the Sega Saturn. This is clearly a build that had a lot of work done on it, but it has never surfaced and this footage is all we have. Thank you so much for watching. If you want more like this, check out my really old video on Sonic Adventure's Saturn prototype that for some reason is my most viewed video. Also, check out my video on nearly every lost NES game if you want something with a grander scale. This is going to be my last main video I make this year, and I'm looking to move away from making dry videos about trivia and factual information and focus on just talking about things I find interesting more. So this will be my last video that will be so heavily reliant on that. But I still plan to cover lost media and whatnot in the future, just less from that kind of perspective. Anyways, special thanks to my amazing patrons. I'm shocked at how many of you want to support me and I'm very grateful. Thank you for watching.